Hi everybody and welcome back to week 6 of our doula training. It's a very cold, wet and pretty miserable day here in Melbourne that I'm recording on. So I'm nice and warm at home as I'm doing this. So what we're covering in this week's session is, as you can see from the slide, the antenatal, the prenatal meetings with clients, and also a little bit about birth plans. So what do birth plans kind of look like? What sort of information is likely to be helpful to include in them, and how we can help clients to create a good birth plan or birth preferences. We'll also in this session look at the concept of reflective or active listening, because that plays a really important role when we are meeting with clients, particularly in that antenatal period. Because it really is a great skill to have, in that it helps to really understand what clients are wanting and what their expectations are, and clarifying some of their goals as well. So that's what we've got for this week. So before we sort of look in detail at the sort of content that we would typically cover in an antenatal appointment, I think it would be just helpful just to focus for a second on the really wide range of emotions that a person is, very likely to experience during labour and birth. Although this isn't sort of, I suppose, a formal activity or assignment per se, I think it would be helpful though if you just want to jot down, in your notebook or however you're keeping your, your own notes and records for this course. As you can see from the slide, and if we were sort of together in person, I think what we would do as a group is sort of brainstorm together. But for the purposes of you obviously doing this at home, if you can just jot down, what you would imagine would be that really wide range of emotions that a birthing person might experience during labor. And here are just some dot points to sort of get you thinking about what those emotions might be. If you remember from the last session, we really looked a little bit more deeply at hormonal physiology, that fear, tension, pain cycle, and what happens to oxytocin release, which is that love hormone, that critical hormone we need for for labor to progress well and for the uterus to contract really efficiently. In order for oxytocin to be released in the sort of the amounts that we need it, people need to be feeling very safe and very supported, and and really cared for. So depending on, is she feeling that way, or is she possibly feeling, quite nervous and stressed and anxious and perhaps not particularly safe? So again, the emotions will vary according to that. And how could these emotions impact on her? How will she potentially remember this labor and this birth? One thing I think is a really important thing just to sort of tuck at the back of your mind is the fact that if your client, say, opted for medical pain relief, let's say she asked for an epidural, don't assume that just because the pain is sort of removed, that she won't experience any more, anxiety or fear. And in fact, in some situations, the anxiety can actually go up a few notches, because when she's not completely focused on managing the pain or the intensity of labor, now she's sort of quite comfortable, sometimes the brain goes into overdrive. I remember reading some time ago and seeing a post, I think it was from the US, but it was, a doula to say, what role do I possibly have to play if my client's got an epidural? I'm just going to sit there, in a chair and sort of, scroll, through Instagram on my phone, which by the way is a big no-no, I should have to say. But I think it's a real kind of misnomer to assume that if your client has got medical pain relief, that they don't need you. In some cases, they actually might need you even more. Sure, it's not necessarily going to be that really physical hands-on support that doulas can provide, you know, the hip squeezes and the massage and the counter pressure and acupressure points and all those things that, sure, she might not need right now, but she needs that informational support. She needs the emotional support, and they are equally important in your role as a doula. So that's just an important point I wanted to make there. And my last point on this slide is my takeaway, which is that it's not your client's job to sort of stay positive throughout. You know, she's going to have this real up and down emotional journey throughout the birth. It's really the role of everybody else in the room. You know, you as her doula, you know, if she has other family or members or a support person or a partner, and also I would say the role of her medical care team as well, to be really encouraging and really supportive, and to really sort of just keep her thinking really positive thoughts throughout. So, you know, how you, I guess, want to lay this out, entirely up to you. Don't just sort of jump to sort of really negative emotions, because we want, you know, to ensure that we're not forgetting that, you know, birth can be a really beautiful and incredibly positive experience as well for many people. So be sure when you are writing down this sort of range of emotions that you are including really positive emotions as well, that encompass those feelings of joy and accomplishment and achievement as well. So that's just a little exercise for you to do, and if you like, you can pause the video here, go off and do that, and then come back and watch the next slide. So this slide is just a very basic overview, if you like, of the sort of high-level, sort of broad topics that you would typically cover in your appointments. And again, just a reminder, so with your Birth for Humankind clients, your antenatal visits can take place in a number of spaces, and they can include your client's home. It could be a community space, it could be a local cafe that's convenient for both of you, or it could be at the hospital where she's having her baby as well. Sometimes the doula also attends an antenatal appointment, so you could kind of encompass both the appointment in antenatal clinic with the midwife, and then go and maybe have a cup of tea together in the cafeteria downstairs, and have your antenatal appointment there. So you can see in the slide here, the sort of topics that you would expect to cover with your client would be a birth plan or birth preferences, and how you develop that. Not everybody wants to put together a sort of a physical document, but even if ultimately they decide not to do that, for your own sort of information and important notes that you have on your client, I think it's important that at least you make a note of things that that she's pointed out that are really important to her, that either happen or that she'd like to avoid. You would discuss comfort measures, what we just sort of broadly describe as comfort measures. So these are sort of your non-pharmacological, non-drug options for comfort in labor. Sometimes they get called active labor positions, but the comfort measures also, again, sort of encompass a very wide range of things. So it's kind of everything we can do to help make labor more comfortable for clients that doesn't involve medical pain relief. Saying that, of course, we also want to help to explore the medical pain options for her as well. Knowing that everybody will make different choices, and every birth can kind of throw up its own unique set of circumstances. And even if you have a client who is, perhaps prior to going into labor, very keen to avoid medical pain management options, things may occur during the labor in which she will change her mind, and so we want her to feel really informed about all the options, the non-drug as well as the drug options. Obviously, the antenatal appointments are often very much about answering questions, clarifying things. She may have had appointments and not fully understanding what was going on. Particularly if you attend an appointment, that's really helpful, because then obviously you were there and you might be able to help clarify some information or any concerns that your client may have. What you'll also do in these appointments is kind of walk her through what will happen. So, what happens when labor begins, when you would, you'd expect her to be in touch with you by text message, by phone, when when and where you would meet with her, at what stage of labor, and then also what to expect when she arrives at the hospital. So it becomes really helpful for you to be familiar with these different hospitals. Again, with Birth for Humankind, we are really primarily talking about public hospitals. In Melbourne here, the Royal Women's, Joan Kirner, the Northern, Mercy, Monash over in the southeast, etc. So, obviously not everyone's going to be attending births everywhere, and there's no expectation to sort of have, inside out knowledge of every single hospital. But as you become more experienced as a doula, you will become more familiar with each of these hospitals, and that's so helpful because you can sort of say to your client, okay, so when you arrive, you're going to go to this triage area or this assessment room, and this is what's going to happen, and you likely spend a little bit of time here, and if you're in labor, then you'd go to the antenatal unit, and etc. So you're kind of just helping make a little bit more real for your client, and so that on the day she'll go, oh yeah, I remember my doula talked about this and said this was going to happen, or that I would probably go here first, or the midwife would ask me these questions, and so forth. So the more knowledge you have, that eventually the more information will be able to pass on to a client, and of course, very importantly, to let your client understand when they need to go to hospital as well. Okay, so there we go. On the next slide, we'll sort of look at a little bit more detail about what these appointments might look like. So in this slide, as you can see, I've done a bit of a flow chart. I don't think I've done flow charts since I was at school, but I thought this might be helpful just to sort of really explore in a little bit more detail the sort of things that, again, you might cover in your appointments with your client. And look, don't sort of take this as as gospel, so to speak. You don't have to cover all of this, and certainly don't have to cover these topics in this order. It's more, I think, the more information you have, the more options you have, the better prepared you might feel when you are actually meeting with clients. So obviously at the very beginning, it's all about getting to know each other. It's about building that relationship of trust and really becoming familiar and comfortable with one another. Doula work is you absolutely would already expect and realize is a very intimate relationship. It's to be present at the labor and birth of someone's child is not just a beautiful and incredibly sort of special experience, but it really is a very intimate one as well. So it's important to get to know each other and spend time in that sort of really informal way as well. Then the next bit is to start focusing your discussion around your client's goals for their labor and birth. And I'm just going to refer you to the student workbook, and if you have a look on page 24, you'll see that it says clarifying client's goals. So you might want to use the questions on that page as a way of starting to discuss those goals, clarifying, as I said, those goals, and really helping yourself to understand what is it that your client's hoping to achieve, hoping to avoid. It might, these discussions might bring up, some past pregnancy history if she's had other children, or perhaps some, past interactions with medical or health professionals, and things like that. So have a look at that. That might be really helpful for you. And then based on that, obviously you can sort of start to explore some of those options for her and talk about, based on what she's said that she would like or like to avoid, you can start to talk with your client about, options that relate to those goals and preferences. If your client has had, other children. It is always very helpful to talk about previous birth experiences. Obviously, not expected to have, been her doula at a previous birth, but by all means, talk to her about that previous birth experience or experiences, as she's had more than one child. Did she have her children here in Australia? If overseas, what was that like? Were they positive experiences? Were there difficulties? Were they complicated in any way? And so forth. So that's very, very helpful information to have. And I think also, this is a good point just to sort of reiterate the critical importance of privacy, and really reminding clients that all the information that she shares with you, is strictly confidential. It does not get shared beyond yourself and obviously the doula coordinators. Because with Birth for Humankind, you do need to keep quite detailed appointment notes, which Kath and Christine will go through in a lot more detail with the Birth for Humankind induction training, and they'll talk you through the whole process of record keeping and so forth. But certainly any really personal information that people do share with you or disclose to you, you just want to remind them that information is really kept very confidential within Birth for Humankind. If it's a private client, again, the same thing applies, that only that information is only shared with you, and if you have a backup doula, that you get your client's consent to share that information with them as well. From that information, having a much more full and sort of complete picture of your clients' past experiences, their goals, expectations for this particular labor and birth, that's where you can start to develop birth preferences or intentions, and start to sort of really map out that birth plan. It might be really helpful to just review the stages and phases of labor, and we went through that in a lot of detail in the last session, so hopefully you've got some good information there. You might want to maybe bring along something like your Preparing for Birth booklet, where there's some really good information about labor, and very helpful also if your client has limited English language skills, because there's some great illustrations as well as photos in there. So that might be helpful to sort of really progress your discussions around labor. It also might be really helpful to just clarify the role of each person in that birth team. So obviously your role as the doula, what you do, what you don't do. Understanding if there's another support person, if her partner is there or a close family member. Get your client to sort of really explain to you and clarify how she sees, what role her partner plays, or as I said, her mum, her friend, for example, as well as you. And then again, if somebody is quite unfamiliar with the Australian maternity care system, you might want to explain the role of the medical care providers in the hospital, what midwives do, why a doctor might be involved, what an anaesthetist might be, their role if for example, your client has asked for an epidural, for example, or if a cesarean section becomes necessary. Again, who your client's likely to meet in the operating theatre and those things. So you can go, as detailed or keep it kind of simple and really talk about the role of midwives and obstetricians and doctors, so that she's got a really kind of quite comprehensive understanding of who she's likely to encounter once she arrives at the hospital. Another really important topic to explore are common medical interventions, and this is something that we'll spend a lot more time looking at later in this course, exploring what are the most common interventions that women experience in hospital in labour. These are interventions that typically either start labour artificially through an induction process or augment or speed labour up once labour has begun. But there are other things too that we'll talk about, everything from vaginal examinations, fetal monitoring, pain medications, etc. So again, the more information, and this is just, you know, over time, this is information that you'll slowly absorb. It'll become really familiar to you as well, and you can share with your clients, you know, things that she is very likely to encounter. You don't want to cover everything. You certainly don't want it to be something that becomes scary or overwhelming, intimidating in any way. But again, when people have a very realistic understanding of what they're likely to see, likely to encounter, likely to be told will happen to them, it becomes less scary and less overwhelming when those things actually do occur. From that, again, once your client's got a really good sort of good basic and overall understanding of, you know, what it's like to give birth in a hospital and what these sort of, as I said, these very common or routine interventions are likely to be, that's how we can then help her to understand that she has the right to make an informed decision about any aspect of her care. She has the right to say yes and to consent to an intervention, and she has an equal right to decline or say no to something as well. So, you know, talking about the whole concept of informed decision making, informed consent, informed refusal is a very, very important aspect of your antenatal appointments. You know, we'll talk about the brain in a little bit more detail as well. I think we've covered that a little bit already. So the B standing for benefits, R for risks, A for alternatives, I for intuition or instinct, and N for no or not now or nothing. So it's a very helpful kind of like progressive tool to work through. And you could bring along like a brain card with you to your client appointments, and, you know, even, you know, perhaps do a little bit of a role play together and sort of, you know, pick a very common intervention and help her just sort of understand it by asking a series of questions about it to help her decide if that's something she wants to do or something she'd prefer to avoid. So yeah, so that's a very, I would say, a really valuable skill to kind of hone during your appointments is informed decision making, given it plays such an important part of birthing in the hospital system today. We want to give your client the opportunity to express any fears, any concerns that she has. Again, they may be based off previous birth experiences or previous encounters with healthcare providers, professionals either in Australia or overseas. And there's some really great little exercises, and I'll share some of these so you can sort of download them off Better Impact as well. Just sort of very simple exercises you can work through with your client to help them explore what their fears and concerns are, and then kind of what to do with that. Are these legitimate, realistic fears? Or are they sort of fears that are, you know, things that are, you know, either beyond her control or they're sort of unrealistic and that they're really unlikely to happen, and we kind of want to put some I suppose realistic boundaries, if you like, around those concerns and help to sort of bring them back in a little bit. So look for that with the downloadable materials that you can look through. And again, that's just an option for you to use that as a sort of a springboard, if you like, for a discussion around discussing fears and concerns. I do recognize that for a new doula, and in fact, to be honest, even a really experienced doula, you're talking about, things that can get, complicated or what we would sort of sometimes call in sort of birth work, unexpected outcomes. These are fears that every person has. Anyone who's ever had been pregnant and had a baby, these are legitimate and universal fears and concerns that everybody has. And there is, a lot to be said about giving a voice to those fears and concerns, because sometimes when we do, sort of vocalize them, and articulate what those fears are, sometimes we can kind of take some of the air out of them. So we want to encourage clients to do that. Obviously, that's not something you do in the first 10 minutes of meeting somebody, and hence go back to stage one here, get to know each other. You've got to really build that relationship of trust with one another. But I do recognize that, for any doula, it can be, quite stressful, potentially even quite triggering if the doula herself has a history of trauma, to sort of venture into this sort of territory. So I do recognize that it's sometimes easier said than done to sort of talk about these topics. Moving along to the next little point here is, what to take to the hospital. Again, I will add to sort of the downloadable materials just a suggested list of things that your client might like to pack in their hospital bag. The hospitals do often provide that. I do find, though, that they tend to be very limited in their focus of, they tend to be about, mum's clothes, toiletries, maternity pads and things for baby, which are all important, but there are other things too that I think can really add to a person's comfort in labor as well. Some of these sort of double up with things that you as the doula might take. So, this is a list I provide actually in my childbirth education class. So I'm assuming that they may not have a doula, in which case the partner might take on some of that sort of that role. And so I want them to think about packing things that are going to provide comfort and relaxation in labor as well. So you feel free to edit that list however you like. It's something you might want to provide your clients with. Once your clients had an opportunity to sort of draft maybe their birth preferences, you might want to go over that. One thing I often do recommend is that they take it along to an antenatal appointment and show it to the midwife, and just get their feedback as well before sort of having their final version. Again, with that review of birth preferences, you want to review again pain management options, both so that you know that she's very clear about what her options are, but also that you as her doula feel confident that you understand, what her preferences are, and that, whatever information she shared with you about, how she sees managing her discomfort in labor. If there is a partner, again, we want them to feel really included and part of this really important support team. So again, it's about clarifying how they see themselves and the role that they play, but also the opportunity perhaps for them to share with you any concerns that they may have. So if there's the opportunity for the partner to attend antenatal appointments, I always encourage them to do so. Again, they're going to be at the birth as well, and this is a very big and important day in their life. And so we want them to feel supported, but also informed in the lead up to the labor as well. So the more that they understand and know, the better support person they will be during the actual labor and birth. Few more things that we would cover. As you can see, there's a lot that we do cover in these appointments, which might be a couple of hours long each. Is the opportunity to practice some of these relaxation techniques, sort of active labor positions, things like a progressive relaxation exercise. You might practice with her just some gentle focused breathing. You might show and demonstrate on her things like a counter pressure technique, like a double hip squeeze. Again, these are things we're going to do in person at our session in week 7. So, running through a variety of things that just to give her a bit of a taste and sort of sense of what these positions look like, how they feel physically. It's an opportunity as well for partners to learn some simple sort of massage techniques, acupressure points, things like that. You're not going to be with your client from the very beginning of labor, so it's really helpful for her, and if she does have a partner, for them as well, to learn some of these really, quite basic but very effective comfort measures that they can do at home by themselves before you would, labor would have got to a point where you would be meeting them, say, at the hospital. So, having an opportunity to practice some of those techniques is very helpful as well. Again, if you bring along something like your Preparing for Birth booklet, there's a really big section in that booklet called Comfort Measures. And again, lots of photos, that really help to illustrate what you're trying to show or get them to practice. And that's a really helpful way to communicate, some of these techniques. And then just finally, a couple of final points here. One is just confirming what the plan is. So what happens when labor begins, who she calls, when she calls you, when you agree that, you will aim to be with her and to support her. Again, will that be at home? Will that be meeting them at the hospital? And so forth. So again, she's very clear about that communication plan between you and her when she is in labor. And then this obviously isn't applicable to everybody, but if you've got a client who does have other children, make sure that they have got a plan in place for childcare. It is not your responsibility to babysit or to in any way care for her other children or any other member of Birth for Humankind, staff or other doulas. But make sure that you've had an opportunity to talk to them and say, so when you go into labor, who will you call? Who will your children, be cared for by, so that they feel that they've got that plan all sort of, set up and organized, and they've got their support in place for their children. Occasionally there really isn't other family or friends that they are able to leave their children with, and so sometimes what happens is the partner will remain with their other children, and you will be the sole support person. That's happened as well. So yeah, but I think these are all, as you can see, a lot of information, but all really, really important. And the time to discuss all these things is in the antenatal period. It's not in the birth suite during labor. The better prepared that your client is, with that information, with, clear expectations, with a good, solid and, well-informed birth preference or birth plan, she will be able to, enter, I suppose, this period of labor feeling a lot calmer, a lot more confident, a lot more informed, and that goes a very long way to helping her to manage labor, with hopefully not too much anxiety in the room, and to have her, off to a really good start from a sort of hormonal perspective, feeling calm and centered and focused and so forth. So I hope that's been helpful. As I said, I'll post a couple of those extra links so you've got them as well. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit more now at birth plans or birth preferences, whatever your preferred term is. So kind of what is a birth plan, and very importantly, how do we help our clients to create an effective birth plan? So that's what we're going to start covering from the next slide. So we're going to have a little bit more of a sort of in-depth look at essentially what is, what makes a birth plan a good birth plan, or and also what makes one not a good birth plan. Unfortunately, there can be a little bit of eye rolling, and when it comes to birth plans, and And sometimes, unfortunately, care providers don't particularly, respect them or take them seriously. And I'm sure also that, you'll have clients, come across women who sort of will say, oh, I wrote a birth plan last time and, it didn't even come out of my bag. Or, oh, my friend had a birth plan and nothing on the birth plan happened. So there can be a tendency to sort of, not see them in a particularly positive way. And I think, unfortunately, where that comes from is a misunderstanding of what a birth plan is actually for. And as I said, what makes one an effective birth plan or helpful. And so that's what I want to spend a little bit of time looking at. Some of the resources I will have available for you to sort of download is to look at a variety of different sort of birth plan templates, if you like. Again, you're welcome to use these and use them as examples to share with your clients as well. So this is an example of what is sort of commonly known as a visual birth plan. I've actually got a couple of different versions of a visual birth plan, so I'll make sure both of them are available for you to download and have a look at, and they're editable as well. There are also some really great websites where people can download a whole sort of stack of these little, little graphics, for free, that cover just about every preference you could imagine. And so I often send a link to some of those sites to clients and say, look, have a look at this, explore if the idea of a visual plan is appealing. Then here's some sites where you can download these icons yourself and kind of create a birth plan or birth template that is relevant for you. Some pluses about visual birth plans. Obviously, being visual, they are, they're attractive. They sort of, certainly, visually appealing. It certainly makes it very easy to understand quickly what a client's preference is, what they want, what they don't want. And given how time poor a woman's care team often are, there is an advantage to them being able to absorb information very quickly. What I would say, though, on the downside, what is less than ideal about a very simple birth plan like this, and that's not to say this is a bad birth plan in any way, but it's very simple, is that occasionally I think there is we can run into the danger of almost oversimplifying a labor and labor preferences, and that we are more than the sort of sum total of a series of icons, and people's circumstances are a lot more complex than that. So we want to strike a balance between having information that is clear and clearly understood, but is also not, we don't want to sort of oversimplify or dumb something down if there is something really important to communicate. So the other visual birth plan template that you'll see, which I haven't got here in the slideshow, but is actually rather than presented in this sort of horizontal format in Word, for example, it's in a vertical format. So it allows for more written text to be included in between the icons. And of course, you don't have to, a woman doesn't need to limit herself to just a single page, one side of one page. I would encourage and recommend that a birth plan is quite succinct and brief. We don't really want to go over, a double side of a single sheet of paper, if at all possible. And that should be enough to also include things like in case of a cesarean or in case of an induction of labor, for example. And I think those things are really important to include in a birth plan, because, we know that, those rates of intervention are very, very high. And if somebody hasn't even considered the possibility of those things happening, and then they do, and they haven't spent any time actually considering what their options and their preferences are around those interventions, that can be, one of the sort of causes of, unexpected anxiety and stress at the birth itself. So as I said, these are some visual birth plan options. And I'll show you another one just in a sec, which you'll have a look at from Lamaze International. So we'll look at that one now. So this is another, I suppose, visual birth plan. I think you could describe it as a visual birth plan from Lamaze International. You don't need to be a Lamaze educator. You are very welcome to use it. And again, I will provide a Word version of this that is, editable, and you're welcome to use it or to share it with clients. I do like this one as well, because although, you do ideally need some familiarity with what Lamaze calls the healthy birth practices. That information, though, is actually very easy to find online as well. But what I think is obviously quite easy to understand is the way that it's structured sort of chronologically throughout labor, so from before labor right through to considerations for baby. And I also really like, you can see in the purple column there, in case of complications. And I think, to me, this is one of the things that makes a birth plan a good birth plan, is one that is realistic about the environment in which your client is birthing, that she has a clear understanding of the sort of various policies, if you like, of the hospital, but also that she understands that birth can be unpredictable. And so a birth plan that is not overly rigid, will say things like, under no circumstances will I ... or, I will not consent to, under no circumstances. These sort of things, which are very rigid. There's a sort of an element of control there, and I think, again, helping your client in these antenatal appointments to understand that birth can be unpredictable, and a good birth plan is one where you kind of build in that unpredictable element of birth, in which, if things occur that you're not planning or you weren't anticipating, how might you deal with those situations? Does your client have very specific preferences, questions, concerns, even if it's just a reminder of questions to ask should certain things occur, because then it becomes a really valuable document. And what I always tell clients is that a birth plan is a communication tool. It's a bridge between the client, and between the client and her healthcare provider. Also, and this was great advice I actually got from a midwife friend of mine a few years ago. She loves birth plans. She's very respectful of them and really encourages women to put some preferences together. She says, don't give me your birth plan, tell me your birth plan. So that's another thing that you could suggest in your appointments, antenatal appointments with the client, is that when she does arrive in the hospital, is that she uses that time in the very beginning, when she's sort of settling into the birth suite, getting to know the midwife who will be caring for her, that she says, I have a birth plan, I have some birth preferences, do you have a few minutes for me to sort of go through that with you? It's a really great way to build some, rapport and connection with the midwife as well. And for the client to ensure that, she's been heard and she does clearly understand those preferences. I think as well that a lot can be said for very positive language as well, in that you can communicate exactly everything that you want, rather than putting it in a negative, as in the, I will not consent or I'll refuse. You can sort of flip that on its head and say, if at all possible, or, I would prefer, it's my preference, I would like, etc. So positive language, keeping it quite brief. Another thing to consider is, what's relevant on a birth plan. And whereas, things like music, aromatherapy, the comfort measures, the relaxation, the massage, all those sort of things that hopefully, you'll be there to help provide, and also partners. Not that they're not important, they're very, very important aspects of comfort in labor, but they don't need to be on a birth plan. What needs to be on the plan are the things that that your client really wants her care provider to know and understand about her. And they could include, if she so chooses to include, personal information that she may like to, share with her care team, disclose about her history. It might be a trauma history, it might be previous birth history. It may be phobias, quite profound fears about certain things, whether it's needles or, whatever it might be. But these are things that you actually would encourage her to include, because they are relevant and they're important for her care team to know and understand about her. So I hope sort of thinking about these things is getting you to think a little bit differently about how a birth plan might be helpful and what makes a good birth plan. And a valuable document. So have a look at all of those sort of resources, as I said, the downloadable templates and so forth. And perhaps when we do meet face to face or at a upcoming online check-in, we can chat about that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about birth plans and what you feel makes a good birth plan. So this is a little activity that I'd like you all to do, and it is to actually develop a draft birth plan for an imaginary client. You don't have to do all three, you just need to select one. So I've given 3 different sort of scenarios, if you like, for imaginary clients who all have quite different, needs and backgrounds and histories and so forth. I'll just read through them quickly here. As I said, pick one, not all 3, just one, and using those templates, or by all means create your own. You definitely don't need to use any of the ones that you've got available to you. You're welcome to create your own birth plan or find a different template if you come across something different, but based on your client's needs and what you do understand and know about her, what information you might include in her birth plan. So the first client is a first-time mum. She's 20 years old. There is no partner or father involvement, and her family live interstate. Her best friend is also planning to attend the birth. She has experienced issues of homelessness, but has now settled into permanent government housing. Your client also has a history of domestic violence and views authority figures with suspicion and fear. Okay, so that's birth plan 1. The second client, so your client is expecting her second baby. The first baby was born via cesarean section. She's hoping for a VBAC, which stands for vaginal birth after cesarean. She is a recent immigrant to Australia and has limited spoken English. Her husband speaks better English, but he's not fluent. All other family are overseas. And your third client, your client requires a cesarean due to placenta previa. Now, placenta previa is a condition whereby the placenta does not move up and out of the way of the cervix in the pregnancy. Normally, as the uterus grows, the placenta just naturally moves up and out of the way. Occasionally it doesn't, and it covers the opening of the cervix. And if it has not cleared that cervix really close to her due date, then it definitely requires a cesarean. That's a medically required and completely legitimate reason to have a C-section. So that's why your client needs one. This is her third child. She has a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. Her husband works full-time and can't take much time off after the birth. They have no family in Melbourne. They can't afford daycare for their other children. So normally your client is a full-time stay-at-home mum as well. So 3 very different clients, very different needs and circumstances. So feel free to pick one. And imagine, the sort of, questions you might ask her in helping her to draft a birth plan. So good luck with that. I hope that is an interesting exercise for you. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that we would also include a little bit of information about active or reflective listening skills. Some of you might be familiar with this, maybe through other work that you've done, or with trainings and so forth in your professional life. But as you can see from the slide, active listening is essentially the art of listening. When somebody is talking or sharing information with you, we all have the tendency to sort of want to jump in, to sort of problem solve, to ask lots of questions, to sort of share a side story, or funny thing, same thing happened to me. So we do this very, very sort of almost automatically. And that's sort of the opposite of active or reflective listening. And, as a doula, this is a really, really great skill to kind of to fine tune. So you'll see in Better Impact, there is a downloadable sheet which gives you a little bit more information about what active or reflective listening is, what it's all about, what are some of the skills that go into being a good reflective listener, and then what I'd like you to do as an exercise is, if you could find a family member, it might be your partner, a parent, a sibling, a flatmate, whoever you've got that you could perhaps drag into doing this, and to do a little active listening or reflective listening exercise with that partner. So it's pretty self-explanatory. It shouldn't take you more than about 10 minutes all up. So you get the opportunity to both be the listener and hear your partner sort of share some information with you. And then I'd like you to swap around as well, so that you get the opportunity to share information and they are doing the reflective listening. So you get both ends of that experience as well. And again, that's something I'd love to sort of get your feedback from when we either meet online for our live check-in or at the next sort of in-person session. So make sure you're writing some little diary notes about that experience. And I hope that's an interesting exercise and skill to practice. So this little slide here is just really food for thought, and will lead into sort of the last topic that we're going to cover for this session, which is about what you actually take to a birth. So these are just really helpful, when you are on call for a client, which is generally from about 38 weeks of pregnancy. It is important to basically be ready at any time to be able to go to a birth, and because you can literally get called at any hour of the day or night. So these are just some questions to be thinking about. How can your client reach you? Making sure while you're on call, your phone is always near you, it's always charged, it's not on silent when you go to bed at night. Things like that. Those are some basic but really important things. And if you're really new to doula work, it may be really changing how you just normally live. Most people do switch their phones off at night. So it might be some tweaking, some, just very ingrained behavior that's, doing things in a very different way. Having a think about, what plans do you need to make to, your family's needs for the next potentially day or two. Have you got young kids that need to go to school or to daycare? Have you got any plans or anything that you'd need to make arrangements for, or reschedule appointments, things like that? So just always at the back of your mind, think about what have you got on that you might need to adjust. Same thing if you are, studying, if you're at uni, for example, again, what adjustments might you need to make if you had to go to a birth? And yeah, I've included there, things like childcare and so forth, other appointments. What if the labor really sort of accelerated very quickly and became quite an intense and fast labor, and went from, oh, I think I might need you sometime later today, to she calls you and says, I need you, I like now. could you drop everything very quickly and get to her if necessary, sort of within the hour? And again, that can happen. Birth can be unpredictable in that way. Have you got things for yourself prepared, in your doula bag? Have you got some food, some snacks? It's always really handy to have things in your bag that, you don't need to buy fresh, like sandwiches or things like that, or fresh fruit, but things that can, packaged things which can stay in your doula bag. So you've got some just sort of ready snacks on hand if you needed to just drop everything and head straight off to a birth. We'll cover that more in just a minute. Have you showered? Remember, you could be with your client for a long time, so making sure you're fresh before you go to a birth. If you've got time, jump in the shower. I always do. It's one of the things, even if I get called to a birth at 3-4 o'clock in the morning, I will always have a shower before I go. Often it's to wake me up, but also I just feel a whole lot fresher when I arrive at a birth. And of course, packing toiletries and things that can help you to sort of freshen up through the time that you're with her is important. Please make sure that you don't wear perfumes or have very strong scents because women can be very sensitive to those sort of smells in labor as well. So just being, really clean and fresh. Another thing to consider is what you're going to wear to a birth as well. Obviously, if you're going to be there for a long time, you want to be comfortable. So, make sure that you do have really comfortable clothes that you can stretch out in, but also that are, that are neat, that are presentable and so forth. As a Birth for Humankind doula, you'll also have a badge identifying you. But, it is important to think about what you'll wear. Another thing to think about also is that the hospitals can be really quite cold. So having a nice, warm jacket is really important, a cardigan or a fleecy jacket or something like that is really practical and helpful to have. And then the last couple of things, what do you need to take with you when you meet your client? And what do you see as the most challenging aspect of being on call? And if you do talk to, to experienced doulas, people, doulas who work a lot, you'll hear again and again that probably the most challenging aspect of being a doula, full stop, is the on-call period, because you really can't do a lot while you're waiting for a client to go into labor. You can't go away, you can't really even go out for a night and have a few glasses of wine if you're going out for dinner with friends or something, and things like that. So waiting for a client to go into labor can be just in itself quite challenging. So those are just things, again, this is not an activity per se, but it's just food for thought. Get you to think about, the arrangements that, you're going to need to make with your own circumstances, your own personal, family arrangements and so forth, your work arrangements maybe, and knowing that you could potentially go to a birth at any time. And then we're just going to finish off today's session with having a think about, in fact, what is in your doula bag and what things might you take to a birth. So to finish off today's session, I'd like you guys to have a think about what it is you might take to a birth. So perhaps before you download some of the resources, I found actually a really great blog from a Sydney doula called Amanda Bernstein, who's written a great blog about what she takes to a birth. And the other thing I found actually is a YouTube video, which you can watch from a really dear friend and colleague of mine, actually, Alice Turner. She and I are both on the Lamaze International Board of Directors, and she's a fabulous doula based in Seattle. in the US, and she's created a video about, you know, kind of what's in her doula bag as well. So both of those might be quite helpful for you in thinking about what you might ultimately kind of have in your bag to take to births. But maybe before you read the blog and watch the video, why don't you sort of jot down again in your notebook or online, wherever you're keeping your notes, you know, what you imagine you might need to take to a birth. You know, things for yourself as well as things potentially for your client as well. So yeah, so that's the pretty much concludes this week's session. I hope you find the resources interesting and helpful, and look forward to seeing you in person for week 7 for our active labour workshop.